series. This is, we're almost done. I can't believe it. Seems like we just started back with Isis and Osiris, but here we are, and I think, I don't know about you, but some interesting things are starting to emerge for me. And I think one thing you can see is how comparative mythologists work, because each week we've taken a different story and contextualized it, but also looked for the commonalities in those stories, the comparative element. And it emerges whether you want it to or not, right? And some interesting things are appearing, and it's going to be interesting again tonight with Tristan and Iseult, a romance, medieval romance. So as you can see here, there are many versions: Celtic, Persian, Irish, French, German, British, and Welsh. The Norman French and the Anglo-Norman and the Middle High German versions start to appear in the late 12th, early 13th centuries. And there are four authors there: Beroul, Ilhard von Oberg. You can see it's going to be French and German. Thomas of Britain and Godfrey von Strasbourg. There is a theory, there's always going to be this theory that there's some ur-text behind every story. You know, like there's one story, and then it disperses out into the world. I couldn't care less if there's one story or not. This kind of carries over from biblical scholarship, because we've got to find this one story, right? Because that'll be the story. But I don't want the story. I want, personally, many stories, because the more stories there are, the more meanings there are. Even when we get the one story, what do we do with it? Make many meanings out of it, right? Okay, there's the sermon. Here's where we are. This is medieval 12th century, what we would call the UK. And you can see what's going on here. This is an interesting time because it's not long after the Battle of Hastings, where William of Orange, the Norman king, takes over from the Saxon kings of England. And you can see there's Anglo-Norman, Ireland. But it was still a Saxon country very much. You can kind of think German when you think Saxon, and you can kind of think French when you think Norman. So you can see William came over and took over the island and then worked up, as the Romans tried to do, and got stopped there at that wall, Hadrian's Wall. And the Picts in Scotland kind of shut them down. Great film from the BBC called Centurion about some of this, if you've ever seen it. Anyway, the other interesting thing that might be interesting to you is 1170, the assassination of Thomas of Becket, right? Murder in the Cathedral, T.S. Eliot. This is right around this time when this story starts to emerge, which I thought was pretty interesting. All right, here's the story. It's kind of long, so I want to get into it with you right away, and then we always have lots to say about it, so let's just get into it. So this is King Rivellin of Lyonesse. He marries Blanchefleur, White Flower, sister of King Mark of Cornwall. Okay, so Cornwall's down in the southwest side. And she, Blanchefleur, gives birth to Tristan and dies in the process. Not uncommon at all at that time. Here are her last words from the text. So I'll read from the text itself as I go along, just to give you, I always want to give you a sense of the text itself instead of summarizing so much. She says, "Little son, I have longed a while to see you, and now I see you, the fairest thing a woman ever bore. In sadness came I hither, in sadness did I bring forth, and in sadness has your first feast day gone. And as by sadness you came into the world, your name shall be called Tristan, that is, child of sadness." And after she said these words, she kissed him, and immediately when she had kissed him, she died. Okay. Well, orphan, and he goes to his uncle's place, King Mark of Cornwall, goes to his court. Again, I'm summarizing greatly here, so forgive me, but he shows his knightly and courtly skills, and he impresses everyone. And of course, anytime you impress a group of people from the outside, you've put a target on your back. So, he's also, now I want you to think, as I tell you this story, I want you to think about the other stories we've heard. Orpheus and Eurydice, etc. And see if you can see traces of those stories in here, because they're there. So Tristan, in addition to being a fantastic knight, is a harpist. Harpist, he plays music, plays the harp, the lute. He plays King Mark, for King Mark. You see this scene with David and Saul, for example, this kind of upstart playing. Anyway, and then this is from the text. When the song ended, the king was silent a long space, but he said at last, "Son, blessed be the master that taught thee, and blessed be thou of God, for God loves good singers. Their voices and the voice of the harp enter the souls of men and wake dear memories and cause them to forget many a mourning and many a sin." A little foreshadowing here. "For our joy did you come to this roof, stay near us a long time, friend." And Tristan answered, "Very, very willingly I will serve you, sire, as your harper." All right, so the men start to see what's happening, the barons, and they convince Mark to kick Tristan out of the palace. So he goes away to a nearby town, but he secretly keeps meeting with Iseult in the palace garden, in fact. Now, there's a dwarf named Frochin who is kind of lurking around and sees what's happening. And of course, he tells the barons who tell Mark. So the dwarf, Frochin says, "Look, here's what you need to do, king. You need to come and just perch in this tree. And then you'll see they come in and they make love under this tree, and you'll be able to see everything, and you'll be able to catch them and deal with this situation." And here, they see Mark's shadow, and they do this little play for King Mark. Brilliant. They do this little play within the story where they're like, "Oh, well, I'm really attracted to you, but I don't think we can do this because it wouldn't be right to King Mark," right? That's right. It's fantastic. And so they act this out. There's Mark in the tree. They act this out. Oh, you didn't see? Yeah. Yeah, see, you would have got caught. I guess they have a little cat or something. I don't know. Let's not think too much about it. So Mark says, "Barons, why did you lie to me? These people are okay. They have attraction toward each other, but their loyalty is greater than their desire." Yeah, Mark, that's what's happening. The barons are no fools, and so they continue to see what's happening again, because you cannot conceal such a thing. And so, again, they convince Mark that something's going on, and the dwarf Frochin says, "Okay, listen, you all are all idiots, so let me give you a foolproof plan here. Let me just spread flour on the floor." Because now Tristan is in the palace, and he's actually all kind of sleeping in one room. I know. It's the Middle Ages. They're all kind of sleeping in one room, so all Tristan has to do is walk over to her bed, which was not Mark's bed, it's the Middle Ages, and then they have sex all night, and then he goes back. So the dwarf says, "Hey, let me just spread some flour on the floor, we'll catch him." Tristan, however, being Tristan, and being a man of many means and many wiles, we might say, jumps over the flower. Ha! So there. Makes love to Iseult all night, but he tore open one of his many wounds and bled into the bed and on the flower. Again, feel free to engage your symbolic interpretations at any point. Mark now is convinced that Tristan is unfaithful to him and to his kingdom, and so he condemns them both to death by burning. All right, so they're escorting Tristan to the fire, and Tristan says, hey, I'm going to die. You caught me. Can I at least say a prayer in this little chapel before you set me afire? Mark, again, the brilliant strategist, says, sure. Tristan goes into the chapel, which is above the sea, and there's actually a place called Tristan's Chapel in Cornwall, and jumps out the window. Lands on a smooth rock, it says, and survives. So he leaps from a window to the seashore below. Somehow the wounds don't reopen. This is mythology, not the logical, but the mythological. He rescues Iseult and retreats to the forest of Moroi. He also brings along his friend, his companion, Governal. All right, so now they're living in the forest. They were in the palace garden. Now they've moved out to the forest. In the forest, Tristan and Iseult now are living in nature. They're completely, pretty much separated from culture. They sleep in beds made of tree boughs. Their life is difficult, as one's is in nature. But when you're so much in love, that doesn't matter, right? You'll exist on anything and anywhere as long as you're in love. One day, they meet a hermit named Oghren, who says they should repent of their sins. They tell him they can't because of the potion. Meanwhile, Mark has offered a reward for their capture. Governal kills one of the barons who betrayed Tristan and Iseult while he's out hunting in the woods one day. And now everyone's afraid to enter the forest, including the barons. So you don't want to go into the forest hunting for Tristan. And this, too, is a trope of literature. They seem to have some security, some safety in the forest until a forester sees them, right? Someone who works in the forest now sees them, sleeping alone in a bower. He tells Mark. Mark comes, our brilliant king, and he sees the lovers sleeping, fully clothed, with Tristan's naked sword between them. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, typically slept in the nude, and of course, if you were having sex, you wouldn't put a sword between you, unless you're really into some weird stuff. Mark, our intrepid king, says they must be innocent because they're clothed, they're not touching each other. In fact, there's a sword between them. There are implications of the cross here, right, too. He takes his ring. It's interesting, the text says, I've got it here, hang on. The text says that Iseult had lost so much weight that her ring was just kind of hanging on her hand. So he takes her ring off and puts his on. And then he replaces Tristan's sword with his own. So he wants them to know, hey, I caught you, I saw you, but I see you're chaste, and so I forgive you with this exchange. And it's basically, in medieval symbolism, Mark is saying you are now part of the court again. All right. Here's Mark's internal dialogue. Then he said to himself, my God, I may not kill them, For all the time they have lived together in this wood, these two lovers, yet it is the sword here between them, and throughout Christendom men know that sign. Therefore I will not slay, for that would be treason and wrong. But I will do so that when they wake, they may know that I found them here asleep and spared them, and that God had pity on them both. This beautiful moment here. And still the sunbeam fell upon the face of Iseult. So they're lying on the ground, and the sun's coming through the leaves, and she's got a beam of sun on her face. Again, feel free to play with symbolism here. King Mark, from the text, took his ermine gloves, his furry gloves, and put them up against the crevice to block the sun. You like that? But he's an idiot. Okay. When they wake up, Tristan and Iseult, they become convinced that Mark means to return with more men to capture them. So there's this wonderful, constant misunderstanding, right? He spared their lives. He wants them to know he was generous and kind and forgiving to them. So they flee to Wales. Okay, it's been 3 years now. And as you know, after about 3 years, the love starts to wear off. And so they now feel guilt. Guilt. Tristan resolves to return Iseult to Mark. On Iseult's advice, he seeks the help of the hermit Ogren, who helps Tristan write a letter to Mark. Again, we're in a written, literate culture, declaring the lovers' innocence and asking that Mark take them back. Mark's barons, his men, advise him to accept Iseult, but to send Tristan away. Now, that's some smart people. Get this guy away, which he does. Rather than leave Cornwall, though, Tristan hides out in a friend's basement to make sure that Mark treats Iseult well. Iseult, listening to the barons, offers to clear her name of the charge of adultery in front of all of Mark's household. She's going to lie with King Arthur. So this predates the Arthurian legends, but as you can see, just a bit, just enough to interact with them. So he's there to support her oath, her declaration. She arranges for Tristan to dress as a leper and to carry her across a muddy bridge so that she can honestly say at this ceremony, to clear her name, that she's had no man between her legs except for Mark and the leper she rode over on the bridge. Lots of deceptions, right? Yeah. King Arthur, promises to defend Iseult's good name before anyone who should say otherwise in the future. And King Arthur says, do not listen to your barons. Okay, so far the barons are the only ones who've made any sense all along. And Arthur comes in and says, don't listen to them. All right. So they keep having sex, Tristan and Iseult. They get caught again by one of the barons. Tristan kills 2 of the barons as they attempt to catch him in the queen's bedroom. Again, he flees to Brittany, to France. Okay, I'm going to try to speed up here because there's so much happening. Tristan helps the king of Brittany defend his lands from an invading army. He's a good soldier. He likes the king's son, Caherden, and his daughter, the king's daughter, whose name is Iseult. Sorry. Iseult of the golden hair in Ireland, Iseult of the white hands in Brittany. Again, feel free to engage your interpretive strategies here with symbolism. When the king offers his daughter to Tristan in marriage, Tristan accepts, so he will marry now Iseult of the white hands because he thinks he'll never see Iseult the fair of the golden hair again. But on his wedding night, the side of the ring that the other Iseult, the first Iseult, gave him reminds him of his love for her, and he refuses to have sex with Iseult of the White Hands. I love that you're so into this story. That's awesome. Yes. Caherdin says, you're crazy, and then Caherdin ends up meeting Iseult of the golden hair and says, okay, never mind, you're not crazy, because she's hot. Tristan goes into a deep depression now because he thinks he'll never see his true Iseult again. He disguises himself as a fool again, disguises himself as a fool, travels to Cornwall, where he convinces Mark that he's crazy, he's a madman. After Mark goes out hunting, Tristan attempts to reveal his true identity to Iseult by recalling the events of their life together in the woods and elsewhere. She does not believe him until he shows her the ring that she gave him. And so they make a lot of love now. Tristan, however, knows that he cannot stay in Cornwall long, so now he's back to Brittany. Okay, so lots of Ireland, Cornwall, Brittany, Cornwall, Ireland. All right. One day, when leaving a tryst, his friend Caherdin, he's out, running around too. He's with another woman, not his wife. Ends up being killed, and Tristan is horribly wounded by his men. Tristan knows that only Iseult of the golden hair can heal him, and he sends a messenger to fetch her from Cornwall. Upon his return, the messenger is supposed to raise a white sail if he brings Iseult with him, and a black sail if he doesn't. Too weak to leave his bed, when the ship returns, Tristan asks his wife to tell him the color of its sail, but she has overheard Tristan's arrangement with the messenger, and in a fit of jealousy, tells him that the sail is black when it is actually white. Believing that his love has failed him, Tristan dies. Iseult hurries to Tristan's chamber. She kisses Tristan and dies embracing his dead body. Believing that his love has failed him, Tristan dies. Iseult hurries to his chamber. She kisses him, dies embracing his dead body, and she dies herself. The bodies of the lovers are taken back to Cornwall, where King Mark, again, has decided to give them an honorable burial. He is. He buries them on either side of the apse in the church. 2 trees with intertwining branches grow up repeatedly over their graves, despite Mark's attempts to curb their growth. Right? A phenomenon people attribute to the presence of the love potion in their veins. Here's the text. This is the very end of the story. When King Mark heard of the death of these lovers, he crossed the sea and came into Brittany, and he had 2 coffins hewn for Tristan and Iseult, one of chalcedony for Iseult, one of beryl for Tristan. And he took their beloved bodies away with him upon his ship to Tintagel, and by a chantry to the left and right of the apse, he had their tombs built round. But in one night, there sprang from the tomb of Tristan a green and leafy briar, strong in its branches and in the scent of its flowers. It climbed the chantry and fell to the root again in Iseult's tomb. Climbs over. Thrice did the peasants cut it down, but thrice it grew again, as flowered and as strong. They told the marvel to King Mark, and he said, don't cut it anymore. The good singers of old time, Berulle and Thomas of Built, Gilbert and Godfrey, told this tale for lovers and none other. And by my pen, they beg you for your prayers. They greet those who are cast down, and those in heart, those troubled, and those filled with desire. May all herein find strength against inconstancy, and despite inconstancy and despite, and loss and pain, and all the bitterness of loving. The bitterness of loving. What is this story about? Oh my God, it's about so much. It's about the power of love. Thank you. It's about the power of love. Yes. The transgressive nature of love, of course. And we've seen this before. We saw it with Layla and Majnun, right? Yeah, I like this scholar, Joan Tasker Grimbert. Let me read you. She says, throughout the centuries, the tale would take on different moral tones, as stories do, with some emphasizing the transgressive nature of the relationship and others the power of love. As Grimbert puts it, at the core of the legend, as it evolved in the Middle Ages, is a passionate love affair that is both fated and fatal. A mutual ardor so strong and exclusive as to override the most compelling family, social, and religious taboos. That's important, to override all that. The poison that is the source of this passion maintains the lovers in a constant state of unrest and drives them to a premature death. There's an earlier version. In the later versions, it's about the reciprocity of their love. But in some of the earlier versions, or at least the fragments, this becomes about Iseult's power. Now, we've seen this before. As we move over into illiterate culture, the goddesses and the women lose power and the men gain power. So this is a really early fragment. She's represented as a magician based on her goodness. Her goodness heals, right? And she's also the one who casts the spell over Tristan. It's not an accident. She does it deliberately. She tricks him into love deliberately. This way, she ends up choosing her own lover instead of it being him being chosen for her. And this, of course, is related to the church and state. So there's a famous book called Love in the Western World that is pretty interesting, kind of the standard on the history of love. Rougemont, Denise de Rougemont, points out that the myth of Tristan and Iseult emerged in opposition to the Christian emphasis on marriage. Quote, the cultivation of passionate love began in Europe as a reaction to Christianity, and in particular to its doctrine of marriage, by people whose spirit, whether naturally or by inheritance, was still pagan. There it is, right? There's that pivot we've been playing with for several weeks now. From the pagan, we would say the oral culture, the oral tradition, to the literate. Because it's only in the literate tradition that you get things like doctrines and rules and lists and institutions. So Rougemont is saying that this is really a story about of this new thing in the world called Christianity, this relatively new thing. He goes back to Plato, and in fact, Plato has some interesting things to say in this regard. He calls this kind of love a divine delirium and says that it's divine love. It's a substitute. What Tristan and Iseult had is a substitute for their love of God, for the love of the truth, for the love of the forms. They got it all mixed up with their bodies, and we don't want the bodies involved in truth. But you know, that was the drive. That's what was pushing them forward. And then, of course, you have the brilliant Joseph Campbell, who called this libido over credo. Wonderful, right? So the life force over the listing force, the belief force, the statements of belief, the credo. Libido over credo. He says, quote, this was one of the most important mutations, this shift into romantic love, of human feeling and spiritual consciousness, that a new way of experiencing love came to expression. Now, we are the inheritors of this tradition, this new thing, and so it doesn't seem strange to us, but you have to understand that for most of the people in most of the world, and still in some places in the world, marriage has nothing to do with love. It didn't have anything to do with love. And in some of those places, it still doesn't. It's about political power. If you're nobility, it's about survival if you're not. It's an arrangement based on survival at its most fundamental form. And then when Christianity enters the picture and says, you know, we're going to control this aspect of your lives because we think it's so powerful. And so enter in the instances of guilt and prohibitions against adultery and fornication. Christianity says that sex is for reproduction. So glad that that notion is gone now. We've never heard of it for centuries. Really interesting thing here, this filter, this love potion. Plato would call it a pharmacon, and in fact, I don't know if you know Jacques Derrida, post-structuralist philosopher. He picks up on this and plays with it quite a bit. This is from Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, where Socrates and Phaedrus get into this wild kind of dialogue about aesthetics, madness, and the nature of true love. And that's where Plato ends up talking about the divine delirium. Interesting that pharmacon also means scapegoat. So this potion, this poison cure, also means scapegoat. In ancient Athens, pharmakos referred to a sacrificial ritual, a societal catharsis. And I don't know if you were here for Meanings of America, but René Girard, the French theorist, makes a lot of this. We won't get into that. But used to expiate and shut out the evil out of the body and out of the city. Pharmakos was the name given to the human scapegoat, who was always a slave, a disabled person, or a criminal, who was chosen to become the outsider, to be expelled from the community during times of disaster, such as famine, invasion, or plague, or just whenever purification was needed. I don't know if that's happening anymore, but think about it. The evil that had infected the city from outside is removed and returned to the outside forever. All right, so Derrida, the French philosopher, contemporary French philosopher, makes much of this. He says that writing is the pharmacon. Writing is the thing that is our poison and our cure. And there's no better example of that than Plato, who decried writing, said it made people in his Republic lose their memory or not rely on their memory enough. But he wrote that, right? Poison cure. You cannot escape it. Derrida likes this a lot because Derrida is very interested as a Western philosopher in deconstructing. If you've heard the term deconstruction, that's who it comes from, Derrida. Deconstructing these binaries of good, bad, true, false, positive, negative. And you know, we walk around with these binaries in our heads all the time. And we live by them, and they orient us. And they seem permanent, stable, even metaphysically true. Derrida is not going to let you think that. They are not metaphysically true. They are poison cure. They are both things at once, and therefore they're not one thing. And so you can't nail them down. You can't build a foundation out of them, these binaries. And if you can't build a foundation out of them, then you can't build a metaphysics out of them, or even a society. All right, I'm not going to inflict too much deconstruction on you. But we can talk about it more if you want. So the potion is this kind of limen. We've talked before about the liminal stages, the in-between stages, between who you are and who you're going to be. That space, this comes from the study of ritual, but it's that space in the middle of the ritual where you're neither this nor that. And it's a crazy, wonderful, terrifying, disorienting space. The leman. So the potion is the leman. Notice that's what happens in the story. The potion forces them into this liminal period from which they never escape. It forces them into this liminal space from which they never escape. They're still in between. And so even at the very end, when they're buried apart, they're trying to join. They don't want the binary. They won't allow the binary. They collapse the binary, even in death. So much going on here. Liebestod, love, death. This is a story about love as death. Remember when he first drinks the potion, Tristan says, "Come, death," because he knows that to have participated in this liminal reality is effectively to die. The naked sword, of course. So much we can make of that. You saw the kind of Christian implication there, but there's a lot more implications of a sword separating lovers. Remembering, of course, that it's all a deception. So there's that. Woman as healer. Again, for me at least, you can argue with me if you want, because I can't defend it completely, but I think these are traces of the goddess, where women were healers. The goddess was a healing force more often than not. And so these stories move into patriarchy and they get turned. So, well, as we saw with Eve and Adam, they get turned completely so that Eve brings death now, not life. It may not surprise you that it would be a couple centuries later that the Catholic Church would begin the Inquisition. And the Inquisition began at first as punishment, as inquiring of midwives, whether they were the devil or not, whether they were witches, right? So here's a group of women who know things. They know how to bring life into the world. And they become the first targets of the Inquisition because they have knowing that the church wants to extinguish, because it's competing knowing, right? We saw this with Gilgamesh, right? Where Ishtar goes from being this divine goddess, this incredibly powerful goddess, to being humiliated in Uruk. Iseult is associated with the moon. Robert Graves, the white goddess, made much of this, that this was the pattern, the pattern of the triangle. One woman, two men. Representing the moon goddess, he said, and a dual god of the summer and winter sun. So Iseult is the moon goddess, Mark and Tristan as competing sun and winter, competing summer and winter suns. There's so much here. And by the way, this is what happens when, two things, when we move into a literate culture with myth and when we move into our culture with myth. It goes below consciousness, right? Because we can't see it because it's too much a part of us. And we have to get outside ourselves to look back at it. And we can't see it because it's writing, and writing deceives. Writing veils. Right? It's dangerous. Writing is very dangerous. So, wrapping up, mythic couple, modern meanings. What are the modern meanings? For me, it's the wound. Anytime you're in battle, you're ultimately wounding yourself. You're wounding a part of yourself that needs to die. You're killing a part of yourself that needs to die, and you cannot do that without being wounded yourself, because ultimately that's what's being killed, is some part of you that needs to go. In Zen and the Art of Archery, the author says that the ultimate target for the archer is oneself. Mentorship. It's a really interesting story about mentorship. We saw that perhaps with Aphrodite and Psyche. That was one of the arguments we looked at. This is about Mark, who's not that bright, but he takes in this orphan who has spectacular gifts. But Mark, I don't think Tristan would have emerged into the man he became without Mark's rough and clumsy tutelage, right? So even when you're with someone who you think is an idiot and who has some kind of power over you, or at least some relationship over you, you might be in the presence of a master, or at least someone who's teaching you mastery. The rudderless boat. The rudderless boat. Oh my God. I don't know how many times I've been in that rudderless boat, but it is awesome and terrifying. The rudderless boat brought me here tonight. I have no business being here, but I got in a rudderless boat, and here I am. Travel is education. I often tell students, I've been a professor for 25 years, there's nothing I can teach you that a trip around the world would come close to teaching you, as long as you have your eyes and ears and heart open. Wounded defeating the dragon, that's the same thing. The dragon is us. The wound is us. The woods, the power of the woods, oh my God. Because the woods, you can see this in Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? Where the woods become evil. But here at the edge of the Middle Ages, the woods become a place of healing. It's a returning to the source. It's ultimately a returning to Gaia, the mother, in the woods. Because remember in the story, they were pretty much safe. They were happy. They were living in trees or sleeping on tree boughs. They were going to be okay until the forester found them. This is a return to Eden, the garden, right? Blood and flower, nature and culture, right? Culture always reveals nature. Nature always overwhelms culture. Because flower is a product of culture. So you've taken something and done something with it, which is the very definition of culture. But blood is your life, and you can't control it, especially when your wound is open to the world. The leap, of course, right? You got to take the leap, especially for your love. The ineffectiveness of guilt. Feel free to correct me. I have never seen guilt do a single positive thing in the world. Not a single positive thing. I've seen it wreck people. I've seen it disable people physically, mentally, spiritually, philosophically. I just don't ever see it working, and it surely didn't work here. I mean, what kind of story would it have been if they'd listened to the hermit and repented of their sins? Oh yeah, you're right. They cannot repent of their sins because there's the story that's telling them that they're sinful is too small in the face of the story they're living. I'll tell you this. Feel free to come back and tell me I'm wrong. That's going to be true of all of us. There is no story that tells you, that you tell yourself, or that speaks to you, where you end up being a sinner, where you live better than you would another story that affirms your life, that affirms your living. Joseph Campbell was all about this. He was, you can almost see him, even though he grew up Catholic and he knew all this, you can almost see him in his development being kind of, after looking at all the world's mythology, and he comes back to Christianity, he's shocked. He's like, this is a death culture, right? I've been looking at all these life cultures. This is a death culture. He's amazed by it. And of course, something else we've seen in closing here is that romantic love is, I don't even want to say it's a symbol of the sacred. I want to say it is the sacred. It participates in the sacred. So all these couples who love, they're in sacred space and time. All right, let's stop there. Thank you for your attention. Yes, and I'm sorry, that is James Franco as Tristan. I apologize.